So in this video today, we're going to start talking about cellular energy. And hi, this is very distracting, so I'm already turn this thing off. So here we go. But in the case of cellular energy, this is the unit where we talk about photosynthesis and we talk about respiration. And with photosynthesis, as you guys know, this is the making of sugar, and respiration is where we take sugar and we break it down to make energy. So in the past, we've talked about this chemical called ATP when we did passive transport and active transport. And ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, which you'll see in a minute. And this is the gasoline that all cells have to have in order to work. Well, just like we need petroleum, which is the bygone products of millions of years of dead stuff to make gasoline, we have to have something to make ATP, and that's sugar. Well, every single cell needs sugar in order to make ATP, but not every single kind of cell can make sugar. So that's why we have to talk about photosynthesis and we talk about respiration together. And you're going to see that they're kind of opposites of each other. But in the beginning, the original source of energy, as you know, comes from the sun. And so the sun shines down on the plants, and the plants do photosynthesis, or algae, or some kind of bacteria do photosynthesis, and then the sugar that's made from photosynthesis get used by other life forms in order to make this chemical called ATP. So with autotrophs, as you guys know, autotrophs are what you grew up calling producers, probably in elementary school and middle school. Auto means self, troph means feed. So autotrophs basically feed themselves. They have the ability to make their own food. So these would be things like plants, algae, certain types of bacteria. We are heterotrophs. Hetero meaning different feeders. So we have to get our food from a different source. We cannot make our own food. We have to eat. So animals, fungi, we're all examples of heterotrophs. But all living things need sugar. That was one of the biomolecules that we looked at. We all need carbohydrates. And we take those carbohydrates, and the mitochondria turns those carbohydrates into this chemical that we call ATP that's needed for gasoline. And so you're going to see with photosynthesis, which is the making of the sugar, its formula is the exact opposite of respiration, which is the breaking down of sugar. But what this chemical that I've been talking about is this chemical called ATP. And this is the gasoline that cells use in order to run anything that the cell needs to do. So just like you put gas in your car, the car breaks down that gasoline. And as it breaks down the gasoline, that creates energy. And that's the energy that's used to run the car. But eventually you'll run out of gasoline and your car will stop. Well, most of us try and fill up with gas before our car totally runs out. And your body's the same way. The gasoline that our body needs is something called ATP, which stands for adenosine triphosphate. And it's made from 3 different parts: an adenine, a sugar, and then these 3 phosphates. Now, as you can see in this little video, just like your car takes gas and breaks the gas down to make energy, we take ATP and we break it apart. And when we break it apart, it's like this bomb going off, and that's where energy gets created. Well, like I mentioned, in the case of ATP, it does have 3 parts. It has an adenine, which is a nitrogen base. We'll also see it, something similar to it when we talk about DNA and RNA. Ribose, which as you guys know is a sugar because it ends in OSE. And then these 3 phosphate groups. That's what the T stands for, adenosine triphosphate, these 3 phosphates. And these phosphates are tied together with energy bonds. It's like having like this lightning bolt kind of connecting these 2 things together. And when we break it, the energy gets released. So just like your car takes gasoline and breaks it down to create the energy the car needs, our cells take ATP and break it down to create the energy. But at the same time, we don't want our car to run out of gas. We don't want our bodies to run out of ATP. So it's actually this cycle that we have. We'll go back and forth, back and forth. And to release energy, the bond is broken between the 2nd and 3rd phosphate, which will then make something called ADP, which is adenosine diphosphates. And we try not to break this down anymore. So we'll take the ATP, we'll pull off a phosphate, which makes ADP, and then hopefully just a few minutes later, we'll stick that phosphate back on and make it ATP again. But in order to make ATP, we have to have sugar. And sugar is made in photosynthesis. So we have to start this unit by talking about photosynthesis, which, as you know, takes place in autotrophs. Well, in order to do photosynthesis, you have to have the ability to absorb light. And this is where things like pigments are going to come into play. But with photosynthesis, organisms like plants can use the sun's energy to produce food. And what they're actually going to do is they're going to use light to heat something up. And this is going to start the reaction. So just like when we want to bake something, we use heat in order to start the reaction. Well, plants are going to use the sun's heat in order to start the reaction. And they have to take water, they have to take carbon dioxide, and they'll use the light in order to make sugar and oxygen. So when we talk about photosynthesis, we have to start off with pigments. And when we talk about pigments, I want you to think of colors. This is what gives things their color. So if you have a red shirt on, you have a pigment in it that's giving off red light. If plants are green, which means their pigment is throwing away green. The color you see is the color that pigment cannot use. So what I'm talking about, pigments are actually proteins. And the purpose of a pigment is to absorb light. That's their job. Remember, structure determines function. So the job of a pigment is to absorb light. Well, if you guys remember from middle school, elementary school, that sunlight is actually different wavelengths. You guys remember Roy G. Biv. Well, I always consider this like a race car. I'm not a big NASCAR fan, but I do know that race cars are painted different colors. And race cars go around and around and around, and they can go so fast that when they speed by you, they look like a blur. Well, that's how light is. Light is actually made up of different wavelengths, and I want you to think of these as different cars going different speeds, but they're all coming at us so fast that our brain, it looks like a blur, like white smoke just went flying by us. Well, that's what gives us white light. But if you slow them down, like you put them through a prism, which is really thick glass, it's like these cars having to go through really thick honey or really thick molasses. They're going to get slowed down, and they slow down enough that our brain can physically see each race car by itself. So white light is like all these race cars just like flying by us, and they go by so fast we just see a blur. They're so fast that our brain can't distinguish the different cars. But prisms slow them down. This thick glass slows down light. And so that gives our brain a chance. The light's now moving so slow that we can see the different cars as they pass by. And that's what gives us our rainbow color. Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. So sunlight's this mixture of different wavelengths, but they travel so fast our eyes can't tell them apart, so they look like white light. Okay. Well, in the case of plants, you guys know plants have a chloroplast, and chloroplasts contain pigments. Well, in the case of plants, they have basically, just like we keep our pigments, our paints in containers, the containers that hold the pigments for plants are called plastids. Now, chloroplast is just one paint can, and chloroplast would hold like green paint. But there are other plastids out there, like some plastids hold red paint, some plastids would hold blue paint. So think of pigments as colors, they're paints. And just like we keep paints in paint cans, plants have things called plastids, and plastids would be like the paint can. Well, a chloroplast, the paint can is called a thylokoid, and this is where the green pigment gets stored. And so as you guys know, most plants are green, and we're going to talk about why. Okay. Well, in the case of chloroplast, the thylokoid would be like the paint can. And I crack open the paint can, and that's where all my pigment is. And you guys know the pigment that makes plants green is called chlorophyll. Well, the job of the pigment is to absorb sunlight. So therefore, pigments only work during the day. So plants have something called light-dependent reactions, meaning they depend on light. If there's no light, this part of the cell cannot do its job. It depends on light. Well, pigments absorb light. So anything using a pigment has to take place during the day. So photosynthesis has two parts. One part is called the light-dependent reaction, and the other part is called the light-independent reaction. The light-dependent reaction uses sunlight. It depends on light. So it has to happen during the day. However, the light-independent reactions can happen anytime the plant needs them to. Back in my day, we had the light dependents were called the light reactions, and the light independents were called the dark reactions. But that made people think that one happens during the day and one happens at night. And that's not what happens. The light dependent reactions use pigments. Pigments absorb sunlight. So the light dependent reactions have to happen during the day when there's sunlight. The light independent reactions don't use pigments. So they don't need light to work. So they can happen anytime the plant needs them to, day or night. So the thylokoid sacs are like our paint cans, and they contain pigments. Well, the most common type of pigment, as you guys know, is chlorophyll. And chlorophyll is green in color. Well, what makes it green? All proteins, remember, they're divas, they only work in certain conditions. Well, in the case of chlorophyll, when you shine a light on chlorophyll, it really likes it when you shine red light, and it really likes it when you shine blue light on it. Red light and blue light are the two colors of light that make chlorophyll work really well. So if you took a plant and put it in a room with just red light and blue light shining on it, that plant would still thrive. That plant would still survive. If you take that plant and put it in a room with orange light, the plant would be okay. It might wilt a little bit. It's not that happy. The color you see is the color the plant cannot use. So chlorophyll uses red and blue. However, it spits out green. The colors we see are the waste products. They're what the plant or the pigment is spitting out. So if you have a red shirt on, that means red light is being spit back out. So our eyes see red light. If we see green on a plant, that's because there's more chlorophyll than the other pigments. So the green light gets bounced back out. The plant throws away the green light, so our eyes see green. So if you put a plant in a room with all green light, the plant would die because chlorophyll cannot use green light. Now, chlorophyll is not the only pigment out there, but it's 90% of the pigments that a plant has. So it's throwing out more green light, so that's why the plants look green. The other pigments are what we call accessory pigments. They're helpers. Okay? They also can do photosynthesis. These pigments absorb light. However, they absorb different colors. So for example, you have carotene. Well, carotene absorbs different colors and it throws out orange. That's why carrots are called carrots, because of carotene. So if you see orange, that's an accessory pigment. The carotene throws the orange back out. So inside of a leaf, there's a whole bunch of different types of paint cans. But if a leaf had 100 paint cans, 95 of them would be green. So the green light overpowers, so that's why we see green. The other accessory pigments are still there. However, like I said, you might only have one orange paint can or one yellow paint can or one brown paint can. They're hidden by chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is the main pigment. It's the leader, it's the bossy one. And so that's the one that shows up. And so this is why plants look green. However, chlorophyll is a pigment, and pigments are picky. Chlorophyll likes to be warm. Chlorophyll likes to have the spotlight shining on it. So chlorophyll likes to have sunlight. Well, chlorophyll is going to work best in the spring and in the summer because it's warm and the days are longer. Remember, these guys are divas. They want to be comfortable and they want the spotlight. So chlorophyll has the light shining down on it during the summer. We have the long days in the summer. It's nice and warm. Chlorophyll is happy. However, in the fall, here in North Carolina, we are a temperate deciduous forest, which means we have 4 seasons and we do have fall and we do have winter. So in the fall, you guys know the days start to get shorter. The temperatures start to fall. So therefore, chlorophyll gets a little ticked off. In the autumn, wavelength of light changes. The days get shorter, it starts to get colder, and the chlorophyll's like, okay, I'm done. The chlorophyll gets mad, it stalks off. Well, what happens is the chlorophyll begins to fall apart. It begins to denature. It changes shape. Remember, when proteins denature, they change shape. If they change shape, they're going to have different jobs. Well, as the temperature changes and the sunlight, the length of the day decreases, chlorophyll begins to denature. Well, when chlorophyll denatures, the other pigments that have always been there now can be seen, because when the chlorophyll denatures, it disappears. So the green disappears from the leaves, and the other colors that have always been there can all of a sudden show up. So the leaves don't really change colors. Those colors have always been there. It's just now is their time to shine. So the chlorophyll, the steva, has denatured, it's fallen apart, and now the brown proteins or the orange proteins, now we can see those. The only problem is these accessory pigments don't absorb the same amount of light as chlorophyll does. So bless their hearts, in the fall, these leaves are trying to absorb light. And these leaves are trying to do photosynthesis, but they can't do enough. And so what the tree does is the tree sacrifices its leaves in order to go into hibernation. Hopefully during the spring and summer, the plant has made a bunch of sugar and it has stored a bunch of sugar, because without the chlorophyll, it can't do photosynthesis as well as it wants to. And when we have these leaves with different colors, they are working really hard, but they can't make the sugar the plant needs. So the plant sacrifices them. And the plant lets those leaves die, and it lets those leaves fall off. And then the plant basically is hibernating. Hopefully it saved enough sugar in its roots and parts of its stem to survive the cold season. And then once the plant realizes it's getting warmer and the days are getting longer, it slowly wakes up like a bear, and it slowly starts to grow new leaves. Now, something like a conifer, a pine tree, things that have pine needles, these kind of trick chlorophyll. A pine needle is actually a hollow leaf. If you take a leaf and roll it up into a tube, that's what a pine needle is. So the inside of a pine needle is actually hollow, and it's full of air. And that air heats up. So pine trees kind of trick chlorophyll into thinking it's summer all year long, because the air inside the pine needle stays warm. The chlorophyll thinks it's warm, and so this is why pine trees are evergreens. They basically stay green all year long.